Hi, everyone, and welcome to Media Capital, a podcast where consumer investing meets media innovation. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Pedro Schmidt, CEO and founder of Kayaks, the world's first fast-acting cortisol stress reducer. Kayaks is built on a science-backed foundation with 3 clinical trials and thousands of professional athletes across Europe using it daily, from top European football clubs such as Paris-Saint Germain and the Swiss national football team to TUDOR Pro Cycling and numerous Olympic gold medalists. After becoming one of Switzerland's best-selling dietary supplements with over 2 million units sold annually, that's the equivalent of 100 million units per year in the US when adjusted for population size. Kayaks is now expanding into the US market, focusing on high-performing athletes. Pedro, thanks so much for joining us. And I think you are in New York. Fantastic to have you here.
Exactly. Thank you very much for the invitation. Perfect timing.
We just finished off a fantastic week in New York. I think after that day after day schedule, you're probably up and running for what's to come. You're staying here for a month, is that correct?
Yeah. So 3 more weeks to go. Yeah. It's going to be a very interesting month.
I can imagine it's a very exciting time for you and for the business. And I know you guys are planning a lot of awesome events in New York. Before we discuss kayaks and the science behind it, I would love to know more about Pedro and how you got to create kayaks. Tell us a bit more about your background and what inspired you to create kayaks.
I think I'm probably not the typical entrepreneur that went to business school and was dreaming of having his own company. As a kid, actually, I am a pharmaceutical scientist. I graduated at ETH Zurich, which is actually quite a high ranked university, one of the best in the world. I think best known for the fact that Albert Einstein used to go there and to be a professor there. So after graduating in pharmaceutical sciences, I first went into the pharmaceutical industry, was a manager there for 4 years, actually specialized in oncology and hepatology. So I was on a perfect career path, but I had this very nerdy hobby on the side. I liked to read clinical studies, published clinical studies on recovery in general. Back in the days, I was still in my, late 20s, still very socially active. And as many people do in their 20s, also like to go out a lot on weekends. Sometimes drank a bit too much and having a hangover the next day. I was looking for natural ways to actually cure and accelerate hangover recovery. And that's what I actually did just out of self interest, reading clinical trials on recovery per se. And after 5 years on this journey, I had a first list of ingredients that totally made sense. I ordered everything online. I ordered a precision balance also. Like in Breaking Bad, I mixed everything in my kitchen and tested it. And I was quite surprised, despite knowing the science behind it, how well it worked. I asked my friends to give me their feedback and also asked them to be very honest because obviously I was not looking for compliments. And if they liked what they tested, then I would take on big risks. And obviously the feedback was pretty good. So that was my path from being a nerdy scientist to then actually founding the company.
Basically, what you're saying is kayaks was originally developed as a hangover medication, trying to build your endurance of social life and having an active life. When did you realize, or when did you essentially reposition the product to what is today, which is a fantastic supplement for high performance athletes?
So today, Kayaks is a dedicated sports nutrition brand, but it was in 2017, the product was launched as a hangover remedy in pharmacies. And it picked up a lot of traction from the get go, being endorsed by healthcare professionals. But eventually, very early on, actually, we started to receive these comments from athletes telling us how well it works also for post workout and recovering from competition or from whatever physical activity. And after a while, when we had a critical mass on comments and even like professional athletes approaching us and telling us, asking us actually, not even reporting, just asking, they use kayaks regularly as a post workout recovery supplement and if it's actually allowed to do so or if they get in any troubles with the doping agencies. And that's when we really realized, okay, there's something there. I went back to the drawing board, but now I already knew what's in kayaks, and it's a quite simple research to look into the science and look up if there is some clinical evidence that it should also work in sports. And I was quite amazed by the huge overlap between actually hangover recovery and sports recovery. And the most important common dominator is cortisol, the stress hormone that's active in both recovery phases. We branched out into sports, realized that's a much, much bigger and more interesting market. And eventually we completely repositioned. And also now today, we are a dedicated sports brand, but also in the US with our launch year from the beginning, we are positioned to athletes.
This is a fantastic story of what it takes to listen to your customers and making those changes to the product. And I'm sure there's probably been a lot of hurdles along the way, especially building an innovative product within the pharma industry, I'm sure. Have there been any challenges along the way or any fears you faced early on? Is kayaks your first sort of entrepreneurial adventure? And what made you shift your science path or career led science to kayaks?
It's definitely my first entrepreneurial experience, so to speak. Now it's almost 10 years old. It has been quite a long and also fairly successful journey, obviously. But prior to that, I wasn't actually actively looking for it. It more or less found me. And I think also in that sense, ignorance is definitely bliss because the path, it's always much more difficult we imagine to be. But I think that's definitely also a good thing so that you enter the journey not preoccupied by what's going to happen. And obviously, you grow with it and you get stronger and smarter and more experienced, obviously. The challenge I had personally was to accept the fact that you not only are allowed to make mistakes, but actually, this is a huge strength. This is your number one primary learning tool. Just do it. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect. In best case, it's gonna be successful, perfect. And if it didn't work, then the learnings is gonna be even bigger. So take those learnings, adapt, and do it again. And working 4 years in a big pharmaceutical company, also having this kind of very structured science background, this is a bit out of character for me, which obviously by now I love it. I love to work this way, but it took some getting used to take the steps and not think through everything in all the details.
What really makes you a great founder and CEO that you are is also having the ability to surround yourself with the right people, which you've done, and having the right advisors. Interestingly enough, you are my second guest out of a very small sample of about eight, nine guests that has a very strong physics, science background. I looked into a study at some point. I was very fascinated to understand what drives founders or if there's some kind of correlation between their early backgrounds. And actually, some of the most successful founders come from very unexpected backgrounds, such as music or, in this case, science. I think you have the prerequisite to build kayaks into a global brand and really excited about the US right now. One thing that probably not a lot of people know or maybe appreciate, because it's a very competitive space, the whole dietary supplement space is very competitive, is that you have a very strong science approach to kayaks, and there's been three clinical trials that have been conducted so far. If I'm not mistaken, one of them was actually commissioned by the Swiss national football team. Can you walk us through how did that all begin for you with the trials, and what are some of the results that you've observed?
My favorite topic to talk about, obviously, the scientific side of things. So the first clinical trial was still based on the hangover case, just to really make sure that it works. There we commissioned a research facility in Silicon Valley to run a study based on 160 participants, which can be considered quite a large study. What they did was to obviously have them drink alcohol, and then to see the next day whether kayaks did have an effect or not. And they measured 19 different symptoms. And throughout all 19 symptoms, they measured a statistically significant results, which is obviously great. So kayaks does work for that purpose. But then moving on to the sports side of things, at the very beginning, again, those athletes that approached us reporting about the positive effect, they don't even understand what's happening. They just understood that for some reason, they feel much better, more energized the next day than they are used to after, let's say, game day or after a tough training session. So that was purely based on feeling. And eventually, when we started to reach out to teams on a more professional side, including the Zurich, one of the top teams in Switzerland, they have a very experienced athletics and endurance coach, guy with a PhD degree in sports science himself, and he was very interested in the scientific side of things. So he agreed to then include kayaks or to test kayaks or have some players test kayaks. There again, also in a quite non-structured manner, they just gave them kayaks and have them report back to him. And obviously, the feedback has been really good. But that actually then also started to get momentum within the Swiss football club environment. So all the big teams now actually use kayaks. We supply them as paying customers mostly. And obviously, eventually, those players that play throughout the year in their Swiss Cup clubs, they come together 3 or 4 times with the Swiss national football team to do the national matches. And they started complaining to the staff. They were used to use kayaks. Why don't you have it? And that's when the scientists from the Swiss national football team actually approached us, telling us the players are asking for it. We want to test the product because actually we don't have any experience. In a worst case scenario, it could even be harmful. We don't know. They're just going to be informing me personally that they're going to be running a study. I said, great. I would love to help you with the study design and support you however I can. And they say, no way. So this is just an FYI kind of message to you. And so I didn't hear back from them for 6 months. And actually, very early on, a news article at the largest newspaper in Switzerland, you could read that the scientists said, quote unquote, the recovery effect is extreme. So that's what they said to the press. They then introduced the results and the study that they conducted to me, which they measured cortisol, how the cortisol levels reacted using kayaks within 48 hours after a game. And it was very significant. Cortisol has a very negative impact on recovery. So the higher the cortisol during the recovery phase, the slower recovery is in general. And kayaks was able to decrease cortisol or normalize cortisol very significantly, thereby also improving recovery in general, which is something that has never been seen before on a global scale. Those staff members, obviously, being a part of the Swiss national football team is not their full-time position. They are normally university professors in Spain, people with high expertise. They even went on to publish the results and present the results at international conferences, something that it's extremely innovative. This second study was an independent study. Obviously, the third study then for us was interesting to see, okay, now with those professional athletes, we know it reduces cortisol. But first of all, does it also work with everyday people? And secondly, what does it actually mean to reduce cortisol? Cortisol has a negative impact on sleep, on heart rate, on mood, on energy levels. So we should be also able to see improvements in those specific factors. And that's exactly what we did in a third study that we commissioned also the same research institute in Silicon Valley to run. And they basically selected a group of normal individuals between 25 and 45. And they worked out as they normally did using kayaks and measuring biometric data. We were able to see that kayaks improves all those factors I mentioned before, from improving resting heart rate, improving heart rate variability. It has a very strong impact on sleep, a positive impact. It improves REM sleep, deep sleep, and then also based on clinically validated surveys, those participants reported that they actually do feel more energized by 9%, and they do have a better mood by 8%. The cortisol reducing effect, which is very theoretic, what does that exactly mean, can definitely also be measured and felt by the people using kayaks.
This is fantastic. It's very challenging to prove the efficacy of the product in general. And you're talking about preclinical trials, and the second one completely independent, so you had no say in it. As I was listening to you, you almost started drawing out your audience for the US. 25, 45, high performance athletes, people that exercise every day. How did the US come into the whole story? You are one of the most popular supplements in Switzerland. Obviously, US is a very attractive market, but tell us a bit more about how you enter this market, what your plans are here, and some of the amazing partnerships you already have lined up.
There are actually three major reasons why the US seemed on paper as the perfect market to expand and scale. And now that we have started to work in the US, we know that was definitely the right choice. But the three reasons, obviously, it's size. It's about 50 times larger than Switzerland. So we need to generate this critical mass then to really expand on a global scale. Secondly, and that's much more important, is the fact that in Europe, dietary supplements are still niche. It's still something that you find in the grocery stores, way behind at the very back corner, dark alleys. And in US, obviously, you have the produce, the fresh stuff, and just behind it, you already have dietary supplements, which is also reflected in the market data. So 3/4 of all American are used to take dietary supplements very frequently, which is a multiple of what you see in Europe. The third and most important reason is the regulatory framework. So in the US, as long as you have strong clinical results, you're able to promote your product very directly. In Europe, you are forbidden to promote scientific findings around food. And by the end of the day, kayaks is still food, which obviously complicates our market development quite a lot in Europe, makes also our success quite astonishing, to be honest. But US definitely is the perfect market to go to. And we started elaborating that project by summer 24. We Equinox in California, from San Francisco to San Diego. Obviously, most studios in Los Angeles agreed to do a 6-month market test, which we did. And within the 6 months, actually at several locations, kayaks became one of the best selling products they carried, especially those locations that are more, let's say, on the upper side, which Equinox is already very premium, but within Equinox, like Equinox at the Sunset and Hollywood, did extremely well. So kayaks was one of the best selling beverages throughout this period. Equinox agreed to list us, give us a fixed listing in California, and also to help us and open doors in New York City, which we also now have concluded. Kayaks is also now available at Equinox throughout New York City, which is a perfect starting point to develop the market, which it's about to happen over the next few months.
And I know there's a lot more partnerships lined up, and you have a very thought through strategy of how you're approaching B2B partnerships. We're not going to spoil that for now. I know it's coming very soon, and we MFG are very excited to be part of that journey. Pedro, we have a section as part of our podcast that we call the shout out moment. This could be somebody that helped you along the way, could be an advisor, team member, or investor. Somebody that you think of and it reminds you of a moment perhaps was quite challenging for you and they really made a huge difference. Is there somebody perhaps that you would like to give a shout out to?
Yeah, actually, there are three maybe groups or individuals that I think definitely deserve mentioning. Just back in the days, and maybe some people now watching the podcast, they're in this situation where they're founding a company. And I remember, obviously, I started with my own start capital, but eventually I had a first small financial round, which was based on the three apps: family, friends, and pools. And back then, I was able to convince around 15 of friends and family members to join actually in the company. I first thought, okay, I just made a really good job to explain the business. So they invested in this business endeavor. But only years later, I realized that they obviously, although the business model and plan mattered, they definitely invested in me as a person, which almost made me emotional when I realized that. Then also along the way, obviously being now almost 10 years in, there were a lot of rough patches to overcome. Although everybody has good intentions in mind, to be honest. A successful startup can also be an easy prey to some people. And I'm definitely happy that from early on, I was supported by my father, who joined the board. He had a career at the Siemens, was a chief procurement officer, so a senior management guy. Also, one of the early investors, Ivo Petrov, a director at Cargill, from both of whom I was able to learn a lot. Also, within sometimes very difficult times, which even accelerates the learning curve even more. They came in at the perfect time and helped me to become also the person that I am today. And lastly, but definitely not least, Roger, who joined the company, first of all, as a co-developer of our ready-to-drink product. And very early on, we realized that, okay, that's our flagship product. That's a product that really is going to allow us to expand globally due to many factors. And he got that much involved in kayaks as a lead investor in one round, board member, and now even co-founder, that he's definitely a very important part of the journey that we already achieved today and definitely for the next few years to come.
Fantastic. Very beautifully said. I just realized I'm going to shift a bit the structure I had in mind because I realized we need to talk about the actual product and the packaging. We cannot miss the bottle and the patent technology around the cap. And tell us a bit about how you consume kayaks, the two versions that you have, and how you created a completely new mechanism for dissolving the powder in the drink.
So kayaks is, although it's a beverage, obviously it's not a drink that you just consume it because you're thirsty or because you're craving something to drink. It definitely has a very specific purpose, obviously helping recovery, reducing cortisol stress post workout, which then again accelerates recovery and improves recovery quite a bit, leading to the fact that your training progress is just optimized and you basically feel more energized the next days. So you use kayaks very specifically for that purpose. It's also a dietary supplement. You're not supposed to drink it more than once a day. And so that's the purpose of the product. If you look at the bottle, although at the first glance it looks like a normal bottle, people will soon realize that there is a special trick to it. So it's a dual chamber system. Obviously, on the bottom you have a liquid, it looks like water, but it's a premixed solutions with some ingredients. On top, there is a special chamber that includes powders that separates the ingredients from the liquid below. And the reason, obviously, is that the ingredients, the powder in the cap is very sensitive chemically speaking. So it couldn't be dissolved in the liquid. The shelf life wouldn't just be there. And that's a very strong indicator that the combination of ingredients in kayaks is very unique. So that we even require this kind of technical solution. To drink the product, you have to push down a red button, release the powder into the liquid below, shake it really well. You're gonna see it's changing color from transparent to yellow, and then you're basically good to go. For the longest time, kayaks actually was launched as a powder, as a ready to mix, a pouch, a sachet that you dissolved in a big glass of water. And for the longest time, I excluded the thought that we would ever be able to launch a ready to drink, just because I knew that the ingredients are too sensitive to bottle them and have them shipped in cans or bottles or whatever. And that's why Roger, who I mentioned before, was such an important part of the journey, because we actually found us more or less at the same time while we were thinking of how can we continuing expansion within Switzerland. He was looking for the right product where it really makes sense to have this kind of technology. It's his company that we eventually merged into kayaks. And yeah, that was back in 2022. We co-developed kayaks, the kayaks ready to drink. It's basically the same formulation, the same efficacy, but it requires some technological tweaks here and there to make it possible. And yeah, that's how we came to work together. Yeah.
So I guess this is one of the lessons, if you like, that you take over the last decade. Are there any other lessons or things that you wish you'd known earlier before you started kayaks?
I think something that when you see it and then you cannot unsee it, so to speak, but I was a bit blind or ignorant to really recognize maybe for too long the fact that everything has two sides. It sounds super logic. If you talk about it, it's very obvious, but living through it sometimes isn't. For instance, if you have a very rough period, that might prepare you to a future period, which definitely will come, that in this case even was an advantage to go through that period. At the same time, when things come easy, that can be one of the biggest risks. Look not at the bright side, not be naive and think, okay, this will help me sometime in the future. No, but really to understand what kind of learnings am I currently making out of this situation. At the same time, if something comes in very easy, if today a major retailer would be calling us and saying, well, you're going to be listed in 20,000 point of sales throughout the US, which is unexpected, I would need to understand, okay, what steps did we leave out that could lead to a risky situation in the future? And this is something that helps me a lot to continuing to grow, which I hoped back in the days I already knew. Yeah.
Are there any lessons that you're learning right now from expanding to the US? I know it's been about a year in the making. I'm sure there's been quite a few.
Retailers are quite open-minded looking to the product. It seems to be easier to get into retail, but at the same time, obviously, if you don't make it, it's very easy to be kicked out. In Europe, although you have more or less the same shelf space, though the products on shelf had been there for decades. You have the Coca-Cola products and then you have the traditional Swiss products. And it's very difficult to get into shelf. But when you're there, it's also very difficult to drop out. The same is for the US. Then again, getting into shelf, you can be quite happy about it. Okay, that was easy. At the same time, okay, wow, what do we need to understand not to drop out immediately after that? And since the market in US is so much bigger, so much more saturated than it is in Europe, your communication needs to be much sharper. You need to be much clearer who you are, who is your target group, what kind of benefits do you tackle and do you promote and promise. And this was definitely a very interesting learning curve. This week, since I've been here, I've recently have been in Los Angeles at the Beverage Forum collecting these kind of experiences. And this is now making our case much stronger going forward into the campaign.
One thing I appreciated from the early conversations we've had months ago, you knew how to approach the US and going to specific markets such as California and New York, as opposed to spreading yourself thin. I think this is a very common mistake that every international brand makes, assuming that US is all the same. I look at the US almost at three different regions altogether. The West and the East and the Center are fundamentally quite different. And I think that's one thing that I really liked about your plan and your approach. You were very specific, not only in the messaging, but in which markets you want to go after.
Thank you. I think that's definitely a learning also from the past. Even in Switzerland, where we are, again, one of the best selling dietary supplements on the market, it's a quite fragmented, complex market, although very small, which makes it even more complex. You have three different language regions and so on and so forth. And there we learned that kayaks works extremely well in urban areas. And as soon as you just leave into the suburbs, our market actually starts to thin out. That's in Switzerland, where dietary supplements are still very niche and not very popular. But we knew that people within urban societies and communities, they respond to the product very well. But definitely one of those learnings that agrees with you, what you just said, we actually had to somewhat sharpen the communication for the audience in New York City than it is to Los Angeles. And that's more about local activations that we're doing, like with demos and stuff like that. Obviously, the main communication is still the same for both regions.
Pedro, we have a quick fire round of questions. They're supposed to be 30-second questions, but then I think we always build on those answers and they turn into more 2-minute questions. But we'll give our best try to see if we can keep them short. The first one, here it comes. What advice would you give to your younger self?
Experience doesn't actually equal to competence, to be honest. And when you're young, when you start out, you look up to those people based on their CVs. And very early on, even at a young age, you just realize something is off. And you lose so much time and energy being blinded by just the halo effect of titles and CVs and experience. And there's nothing bad about it. If you have had a big corporate career, that's just a whole different ballgame than it is to have a startup. Just because you're a good soccer player, you're not going to be a good basketball player. And it's about the same difference. And to learn that, understand that would have been very helpful.
What's your top tip for emerging founders that are expanding to the US market?
Focus on one small area, be as niche as possible, just to start in and to see how to expand from that. Because expanding when you have set an anchor point is much easier than spreading yourself thin and going out of breath before you have anything sustainable.
Sorry, I'm hijacking our quick fire round. One thing that I wanted to add to, and I didn't mention before, is that with a relatively small budget, you can make your brand look huge in a specific region, unless obviously maybe the means are there or it's a consumer tech product or service. It would be very challenging and you would spread too thin. Also, resource wise, not only, of course, messaging and the complexity that comes with it, but in terms of media and marketing budgets, you can achieve a lot more if you're focusing on specific markets. What's the most counterintuitive thing you've learned as you're building your media strategy? Speaking of media strategies.
This is also a common mistake, I think, when you have these discussions and then these approvals on board level that people say, okay, you're having these huge campaigns. We can expect immediately to have, huge revenues, which eventually is true. But what people have to also consider is the funnel theory that there are upper funnel things, lower funnel things, and having these activations are more on the upper funnel side that don't necessarily translate directly into sales. Obviously, they're going to drive sales, but it's not a direct approach basically to conversions. That's more the lower funnel things. People need textbook information, 7 connection points with the product until they're able to make a decision. You're just going to building the first, let's say, 2 to 3 to 5 connections points up there. And with the traditional e-marketing campaigns, retargeting, that's when you can get people to convert. But the very important thing is not only that you're driving people down the funnel. I think the most important part of it's by bringing brand equity, which is long lived, which is sustainable. Everybody who is, let's say, over the age of 30 can remember when we were watching linear TV in the 90s and early 2000s. And most of these products are still around because they just have such a strong brand equity. If you see something on TV, if you see like a big out of home campaign, this builds a brand that really sticks with you for decades. And I think this is the strongest part of this collaboration and this marketing campaign is that we are able to build this brand equity on a level that would have never been possible. And then obviously eventually is going to be translating into a multiple in sales.
I have to say, you made a perfect case for justifying the venture model. I couldn't probably define it better than you have. I also think it's a lot to do with trust as well, which in a lot of sectors, including pharma, financial services, insurance companies, you need that trust, which I think very often comes with above the line. The final question as part of this round, and we've seen last week, there's so much change happening in the media right now. What excites you most about the growth of this ecosystem?
I would say 2 things. The speed, it feels quite instantaneously, which is great. That's what every startup founder is hoping for. But also to some degree, and going hand in hand with it, to be able to get the traction on the ground is also the partnerships that we are building during those workshops, having investors coming in, partners coming in, opening the doors, having ideas how it can be further integrated. It's not only like a campaign that you work on and then it's over after a couple months, but really people, getting committed to making kayaks as big as possible, being very sustainable, not only on a superficial level, but on a very deep down level. And the combination of both, I think, is incredible, powerful to have something quick, but at the same also something sustainable.
What I want to leave our listeners with is your vision for kayaks. I know you have huge plans for the US. Where do you want to take kayaks? Where is kayaks going in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years?
Already in your introduction, I mean, the mathematical calculation is pretty easy. From Switzerland to the US, it would be around 100 million units sold per year in the US, but that doesn't consider several points. Again, in the US, the market for dietary supplements is much larger. People are much more used to. Also, we are able to promote the product much more direct, which helps us a lot. So I personally believe the potential is much higher than that. But at the same time, I think this is already a good target to go after. This is more the, let's say, midterm perspective, as you mentioned, maybe 2 or 3 years. In a long-term perspective, I am really looking to build a legacy, a kayaks legacy, even at the point in time, obviously, when there's going to be an exit one way or the other, an IPO or an acquisition, having investors on your cap table, this also obviously is a very important part of your long-term strategy. But even when I'm probably no longer an active part of kayaks, I really want to, see kayaks around for many decades to come.
That's a fantastic target to aim towards. 100 million units in 3 years and building a legacy brand, a household name in years to come. Pedro, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. I feel like we could do this for hours. I'm definitely going to invite you again once the campaign is live. We're going to have a lot to talk about, I'm sure. But really excited to have you with us and have you in New York, and can't wait to get things started in less than a month and a half. Yeah, really, really excited. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Diana. It was always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you. So looking forward to continuing our discussions.
Thank you, Pedro. And thank you for joining us on Media Capital. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review, follow the pod, and subscribe at mediaforgrowth.com.